Okay, welcome back. So this time we're here to discuss the geography of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is really a fascinating region that is full of mystery, and scholars are still trying to uncover this mystery even to this day. Now, there are two main subregions that we'll focus on in Southeast Asia. One is mainland, and the other one is insular. Mainland refers to obviously the countries that are located on the mainland part of Southeast Asia. Those countries include Myanmar, also called Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Now, insular Southeast Asia in general refers to the islands down here to the south, although Malaysia exists on both the mainland and the island parts of Southeast Asia. So just for ease of study and discussion, we'll include those. We'll include Malaysia in the insular region. Other countries include Indonesia, East Timor, also called Timor-Leste, Brunei, which is a smaller city-state, and of course the Philippines. Seismic activity such as volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis are really common in Southeast Asia and have played a major role in shaping the landscape. Southeast Asia is home to more active volcanoes per capita than any other region in the world, making its soil fertile, but the people are usually caught in the aftermath of some of these massive explosions. An example here is Krakatoa, or Krakatoa as some people call it. And there was a recent eruption in 2018. I don't have that included here. Of course, you can find information on that fairly easily. There was a minor eruption several years ago. Here is some really interesting videos, aerial videos and aerial photography of the most recent eruptions. But the most famous is the 1883 eruption that killed as many as 36 to 120,000 people. Earthquakes are also a major factor in this particular area. You can see that the main reason for earthquakes is because of its location, surrounded by the Philippine plate, the Pacific plate, and the Australian plate. And the interaction of these plates with the Eurasian plate essentially creates a massive subduction zone that surrounds this area, creating these volcanoes and massive earthquakes. Now, because these subduction zones occur underwater, the initial wave may not be felt, although it is often felt, may not be felt. But the secondary reaction, of course, is tsunamis. And of course, a tsunami is a large wave that is caused by faulting under the ocean. When plates converge, seismic waves, as you can see in this diagram, reverberate out from the focus, and the epicenter, of course, is just that area on the surface directly above the focus. Those waves, when they come in contact with something as pliable as, of course, oceanic water, it creates oceanic waves. The initial wave is pretty large. It says here an earthquake rocks the ocean floor, displaces volumes of water, pushing it up, creating this first initial wave. Then it sets off an oscillation which develops underwater at great speed. It actually pulls the water near the coast away from the coastline. After a period of time, the interaction between this initial wave and the pulling away of water here actually creates a much larger wave as it approaches the surface. Waves get bigger as water gets shallower, and it can create some major destruction. Now, of course, seismic activity also interacts with weather and climate in this region. Because of the Intercontinental Convergence Zone, the ITCZ, Southeast Asia's proximity to the equator This region is also one of the wettest regions in the world. In fact, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia are on the top 10 list of average annual rainfall, with about 8,299 millimeters of rain between the three of them. Of course, the ITCZ, we've discussed a little bit before, is largely responsible for the weather and climate in this area. It says here on this slide, the ITCZ is located in the tropics and it follows the sun's direct rays, varying when over land. The low pressure trough between Hadley cells, this diagram right here, these are vertical Hadley cells, attracts wind and forces heat to rise, creating powerful convection precipitation, i.e. monsoons. When sea surface temperatures quickly rise, typhoons can occur. You can go to the earth.nullschool.net and you can see fairly recent satellite imagery. You can actually see what looks like the beginnings of a typhoon here, although it's probably too early to tell. Typhoons are just another type of hurricane that exists in the southern Pacific Ocean. They rotate the opposite direction. Notice here you'll see this low pressure center forces air to rotate counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere, and in the southern hemisphere the air rotates around the center clockwise. Now, if we want to take a look at the ITCZ, you can go here to Overlays, Total Precipitation Water, and you can see what's actually happening here. And this is essentially the ITCZ. The Hadley cells exist in this sort of middle tropical area, and they follow the sun's, the angle of the sun. So as during the January and February, which would be our winter months in the northern hemisphere, of course the ITCZ is located here below the equator. It begins to move northward, and you can see here this is of course the January ITCZ. As summer approaches in the northern hemisphere, May, June, it then comes in contact with mainland Southeast Asia. That has a profound impact on the annual monsoons. You can see here on this map, when we fast forward to June through September, rainfall is much higher than it would be during the winter months. So, in other words, the ITCZ causes the annual monsoons in mainland Southeast Asia, while the interaction between the ITCZ and warming sea surface temperatures have caused continuous typhoons throughout the seasons. These are some climagraphs of major cities: Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Jakarta in Indonesia, Brunei, Dar es Salaam in Brunei, and then Manila, of course, in the Philippines. Now these are, you can tell the major difference between these areas. Brunei has some of the highest rainfall, average annual rainfall in the world, as does Malaysia and Indonesia. Philippines, though, because of its location away from the equator, not as much rainfall, and most of its rainfall occurs during the summer months. You can see here June, July, August, September. So here's Manila, located roughly right there. You've got Kuala Lumpur, located roughly in this particular region, so it's right on the equator. And because of that, you can see here that it gets heavy rainfall twice, so during its spring and during its fall right here. Although it gets a lot of rain pretty much year-round, those are the months where the highest rainfall occurs. Jakarta, on the other hand, because of where it is located south of the equator, its distance away from the equator, it really receives most of its rain during its summer months. But notice here, you got to be careful. December, January, February is summer in this southern hemisphere. And the same kind of reaction occurs here in Manila. Brunei is an interesting case. It's fairly close to the equator, but it's far enough away that it gets a rainy season and a not so rainy season. But because of its proximity, it's pretty wet year round. And you can see that here because of the ITCZ. This is a fairly homogeneous landscape when it comes to the Köppen climate system. Most of the area is within a tropical climate, whether it be monsoon tropical or equatorial tropical, just meaning rain occurs year round. And in the monsoon or tropical savanna climates, it gets a heavy rainy season followed by a drier season. And you see that as you get further and further away from the equator, that's what is essentially occurring up here in mainland Southeast Asia. All right, this is a map of typhoons and the approximation of the migration of typhoons from the Pacific between 1959 and 2015. Most of these typhoons occur over the Pacific Ocean, and you can see essentially this right here. And as they begin to grow in size, they move westward and approach the Philippines and make landfall in both the Philippines and mainland China. They don't really hit Southeast Asia that often. It does occur, but not as often as China receives it on their southern border. Many of these typhoons are devastating to places like the Philippines, and the interaction between those typhoons, tsunamis, and earthquakes and volcanoes can make it a very active area and dangerous in many ways. We see here that most of the typhoons occur during June, July, August, September, October, and November, rarely occurring in January and February. Now, many scholars have argued that global climate changes are going to impact these islands, and especially in insular Southeast Asia, with rising sea levels, increases in sea surface temperatures, which will then therefore cause more typhoons and an increase in flooding. However, others have argued that sea surface temperatures are essentially just an oscillation between El Nino and La Nina years. And the data shows that this is the most likely answer, although there's a lot of questions in the air even about this. So we see here during El Nino years we have warmer oceanic temperatures causing typhoons, and those typhoons will then generally approach and make landfall here in China. But those also, the El Nino also has an interaction with the landscape in insular Southeast Asia, causing much of their droughts during these El Nino years. And then come La Nina, and we see those switch places. Then it's followed by years of heavy rainfall. So if we go back to this original slide, it says here, deforestation, fires produced by dry El Nino seasons. They lead to a loss of biodiversity in Malaysia, but they're largely because of the turning of tropical rainforests into oil palm plantations. So the reason why I bring that up is because deforestation is a major environmental problem, which has led to that loss of biodiversity. And some people do argue that it's caused by El Nino, but more than likely is the increase in palm plantations, oil palm plantations. You can see this in 1950, shortly after the 50s. A lot of transnational corporations started coming into into Malaysia and planting oil palm plantations throughout. It takes a lot of territory, a lot of soil, and so you can see from 1985 to 2020, there's a massive loss in land coverage by the rainforest. This often gets ignored. People don't really pay much attention to it, but it is a continuing problem that is really has to see some changes before too long. All right, so there's of course an interesting link between the geography of between geographic landforms and the development of culture in Southeast Asia. The Austroasiatic and Austronesian people migrated around 9,000 BC through the rivers of mainland Southeast Asia and settled along the coasts and rivers. Now, there's an old Southeast Asian saying that the land divides, but the rivers unite. Now, this saying reflects the cultural landscape in mainland Southeast Asia, because the historical settlements and empires that would develop in this region are largely based around these river systems. In fact, it was rivers like the Mekong River that led to the development of wet rice cultivation by the Bronze Age culture of Southeast Asia. Now, we see in the latter part of the Neolithic era a change from swidden to wet rice cultivation, and that's around 2000 BC, just slightly before 2000 BC. So it arrived prior to the Bronze Age, but the Bronze Age is what really gets wet rice cultivation moving. It says here, by the middle of the last ice age, Austroasiatic and Austronesians had migrated to a large subcontinent called Sundaland. The Austroasiatic people would replace swidden agriculture with wet rice agriculture, of course, much later. That comes around 3000 BC, is what it's believed. Swidden agriculture is also known as shifting or slash and burn agriculture, and it really refers to a technique of rotational farming in which land is cleared for cultivation, normally by fire, and then left to regenerate after a few years. Now, burning plants replenishes the soil with nutrients, but this type of intensive farming required by swidden depletes the soil pretty quickly, forcing people to move to new locations, and it really takes generations for plant life to grow back. Now, many historians believe that the change from swidden to wet rice cultivation was a catalyst that really brought about the Bronze Age in Southeast Asia. And you can see this here. Bronze Age is believed to occur with the Banchang and the Feng Nguyen culture as well, which I'll come back to here in just a minute. So we looked at this map of Sundaland. If we look back to the Ice Age, sea levels were much lower, and you can actually see the remnants of that here in Google Maps. This is what is believed to have been Sundaland. If you reduce, these are very shallow waters. So if you lower the sea levels by, just maybe 20, 30 meters, you'll start to see land here as well. So you can imagine during this era, during this particular era, how much more land there was for cultivation. And this is a map, part of a project to map what was Sundaland, and there would have been several river systems, and this would have been an extremely fertile location for these Austronesian and Austroasiatic people to settle. Now, it's also believed that the Austronesian and Austroasiatic people migrated not only to the Pacific. Migratory routes believe that the Austronesian people settled in the Philippines and then began to settle in parts of what is today Papua New Guinea, or the island of New Guinea, and then from there they spread out into the Pacific Ocean. But the Austroasiatic people, however, it is believed that, and this is through DNA testing and through similar languages, that they had settled, migrated and settled in parts of Sri Lanka, the islands of the Indian Ocean, and then eventually Madagascar. And in fact, a similar type of lemur exists across these landscapes, and many people have suggested that there was an advanced trading network through this particular area between these people. And so this has been called by some people this particular region called Lemuria. Although there's a lot of speculation as to how true that is. There will have to be a lot more research on that before you can come to any kind of conclusion. But it's still interesting nonetheless. There is an interesting side note here, and I think there's not a lot of research on this. But on the island of Sumatra, there is an area known as the Gunung Padang megalith site, titled that because of the large basalt pillars. But it's not, the most interesting part about that is not these basalt columns, but actually the pyramid that exists underneath this place. So if I go to this link, this is an article out of Scientific American, if we can actually get it to load up, here it is. Titled, Long Hidden Pyramid Found in Indonesia Was Likely an Ancient Temple. The structure has potentially been used as a place of worship for thousands of years. An enormous pyramid structure, like structure in Indonesia that may represent the remains of an ancient temple hid underground for thousands of years. Scientists presented evidence of the remarkable construction December 12th here at the annual meeting of American Geophysical Union. Located atop Mount Padang in West Java, the structure is topped by an archaeological site that was discovered in the early 19th century and holds rows of ancient stone pillars, but the sloping hill underneath isn't part of the natural landscape. It was crafted by human hands, scientists discovered. Now, if you want to go to this article yourself, you can read more about it. There's a lot of information on this, but it's from Scientific American, titled Long Hidden Pyramid Found in Indonesia Was Likely an Ancient Temple. There are still some mysteries here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just to understand, these columnar basalt pieces that were formed naturally, so the basalt columns were not actually created by hand. And it's believed, I say one of the most famous examples of this is, let's see, Giant's Causeway in Ireland, and there's a lot of information about this. People believed for years that this was man-made, but geologists further confirmed that this is actually a natural occurrence. There's also the Devil's Tower in the United States, but these columnar basalt pieces form naturally as lava, magma. Let's assume that there's a magma chamber underneath a layer of the upper layer of this Earth's surface. As the magma layer begins to rise, it comes in contact with a cooler environment. As that magma begins to cool, it shrinks and contracts, and it dries and becomes basalt. As it reaches the surface, it condenses and takes the form of these sort of hexagonal shapes, which is the natural crystalline shape of basalt after it dries. And then eventually what will happen over years, these columnar basalt pieces will then chip off the sides of the magma chamber. And it's believed that that's what essentially was used here in the construction of this temple on top of this man-made pyramid. All right, I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but just understand that the Bronze Age is a fascinating era. The Ban Chang is an archaeology site in northern Thailand, discovered in 1966 with pottery dating between 4000 to 3000 BC. Of course, the grave sites don't match up with the pottery, but they are believed to have been around 2000 to 200 BC, and this is where we discover Bronze Age tools. Now, the Feng Nguyen were early Bronze Age culture in Vietnam during, roughly 2500 to 1500 BC. Now, this culture is believed to have been the culture that introduced wet rice cultivation around 3000 to 2500 BC. So, religion has played a major role in Southeast Asia. It is believed that Hinduism arrived in mainland Southeast Asia around 500 BC. This map shows this, or at least attempts to. There are several UNESCO World Heritage Sites, including the most famous one, Angkor Wat, that were actually originally built as Hindu temples, and instead of destroyed by later migration of Buddhism, they were actually transformed, and Hindu statues were removed, and Buddhist statues were put in its place. Buddhism split into two major groups around 300 AD, the Theravada and the Mahayana. Because of its geographical differences and relative isolation, Southeast Asia would adopt the Theravada path. Now, Mahayanas practice public chanting. They seek global enlightenment, and they put more emphasis on the society as a whole rather than the individual. Whereas Theravada, while practicing public chanting, they actually seek individual enlightenment and individual nirvana, that you should look inward to fix oneself before attempting to fix society as a whole. Islam arrives in insular Southeast Asia and is adopted primarily in modern-day Indonesia. It says here that after the establishment of the Islamic Mughal Empire of India, missionaries were sent to Southeast Asia. Indonesia would eventually become the largest Islamic country in the world by population. The autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao would also become a major region of Islamic adherence in the Philippines. Now, this is a side note, but it does relate to the interaction between Hinduism and Buddhism in Southeast Asia. The Khmer Empire began around 802 in the Mekong River Valley, becoming the first to consolidate most of mainland Southeast Asia. I should remove that. To consolidate most of mainland Southeast Asia. Khmer were largely Hindu and built many temples, including the largest man-made temple in the world. You can see it here. Angkor Wat. The largest temple in the world. And to this day, it's a major source of revenue for Cambodia as people migrate there as both pilgrimages and tourism. It's absolutely enormous. All right, let's watch this video really quickly. I'll see if I can get it to go full screen, and I'll be back.
In the Cambodian jungle lies mysteries about the once great Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire was a civilization spanning approximately 629 years. Being a long-standing mystery, the now uncovered evidence details its mysterious rise and consolidation of power, as well as its inevitable demise. The Khmer Empire's rise can be attributed to a variety of factors, but the most important of these is unity in religion and geographical factors around the empire. At the beginning of the Khmer Empire, the main religions were Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism spread to the Khmer Empire through Indian traders and merchants. As Hinduism contained the worship of high gods, religious monuments were widespread to be constructed in the Khmer Empire, including the biggest in the world, Angkor Wat. Hinduism formed the basis of all society and the ways of life in the Khmer Empire. The social systems were remarkably similar to those detailed as the Hindu caste system. They were remarkably similar from the kings to the slaves in the Khmer Empire, and the fact that your social status was set and immovable. This is evident as Hinduism also gave the Dev Raja the power to rule. The reason how they could claim the power was by declaring their religious background and who they worship. Hinduism kept the elites and other social classes from overthrowing, due to fear of being punished by the gods. Later, as Mahayana Buddhism spread through the empire by Chinese traders, it didn't disrupt the social systems and religious equality, as it also had the worship of high gods. Religion was also partially the reason for the water management success in the Khmer Empire, as it formed the basic idea of the seasons. Therefore, religion played a crucial role in the Khmer Empire's rise and consolidation of power. Geographical factors in the Khmer Empire were vital factors that highly contributed to its rise and consolidation of power. Due to the large bodies of water surrounding the main points of the Khmer Empire, like the Mekong River and the Great Tonle Sap Lake, these bodies of water eventually became vital to the Khmer Empire as sources of water and were used for agriculture and promoted the improvement of the empire's water management system. These waters became extremely popular trade routes with countries like India and China, countries that were vital for trade. This linked the Khmer Empire to almost all of the countries in Southeast Asia. It also provided the Khmer Empire with the resources to create an effective water management system that eventually became one of the main hallmarks of the Khmer Empire. This allowed the Khmer Empire to be so useful in rice cultivation and feeding the empire. Therefore, geographical factors in the Khmer Empire were vital to the rise to power. So how did this amazing empire fall? The Khmer Empire's fall, like its rise, can be attributed to a variety of factors. In contrast to popular belief, the Khmer Empire's eventual demise was not sudden and unexpected. It was long and arduous. Religious change and conversion of faith were one of the main reasons of the Khmer Empire's collapse. Due to surrounding countries and established trade routes, a new religion grew in popularity. This new religion was called Theravada Buddhism, and it began causing many problems for the Khmer Empire. Theravada Buddhism was utterly different from the earlier practice in faith like Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism. This religion didn't require the worship of higher gods, and this led to rifts in the social systems of the Khmer Empire. Due to these rifts, people were forced to fight for their faiths, and increasing amounts of civil wars weakened their borders and the security in the empire. As there was no need for temples in Theravada Buddhism, many people started doubting their allegiance to the Khmer Empire, and many joined neighboring Siamese and Thai kingdoms. Therefore, religious change to Theravada Buddhism heavily contributed to the Khmer Empire's collapse. One of the main reasons the Khmer Empire fell was due to environmental changes that the empire was subject to. Due to severe droughts that occurred during the 14th century, it led to the empire's usual seasonal times to change, leading to a decline of the empire's population. Following these droughts were more erratic monsoonal rains that hit the empire, damaging more infrastructure such as temples, houses, and even the water management system. The monsoonal rain that hit later than usual led to the erosion of the deforested soil. This eroded soil found its way into parts of the water management system such as canals and braes, leading to the blockage of pipes. As the king's treasury was empty from defending the borders and creating temples, there was no way for the empire to adapt to the water system to suit their new circumstances. Therefore, the Khmer Empire's collapse was the result of climate change. Foreign pressure in the Khmer Empire from surrounding kingdoms played a crucial role in the fall of the Khmer Empire. Neighboring countries like the Siamese and Thai kingdoms were only growing in size by taking over other kingdoms and parts of the Khmer Empire. They forced the empire to decrease in size, leading to weakened borders. Due to these neighboring rival powers around the Khmer Empire, the empire's already weakened borders were penetrated, forcing the empire to shrink in size and shift its capital. This led to the abandoning of Angkor Wat, allowing for the Thai kingdom Ayutthaya to take over it. This caused the Khmer Empire to shrink to a size to which it couldn't be referred to as an empire. Therefore, foreign pressure from neighboring kingdoms was the last straw in the collapse of the Khmer Empire.
Okay, well, we can stop the video there. It doesn't go into much more detail any further than that. But it's still quite interesting. Now, the video did mention that there were other empires at the exact same time that did some overlapping. As you can notice here, I've mentioned a little bit of some of the main ones. Now, the Srivijaya of Sumatra was largely a merchant-based trading empire. Of course, the Siam of Thailand existed simultaneously as the Khmer, but it would be the Thunburi dynasty that would eventually take control of a large portion of mainland Southeast Asia and essentially displace the vestiges of what was the Khmer Empire. And they would actually last till the 1700s, or excuse me, till colonialism took control of most of Southeast Asia. So at the time that the Europeans arrived, the Siam Empire was on its decline. This map represents roughly around the verge of the 1900s. This was a part of the colonial United States. The United States took control of the Philippines after the end of the Spanish-American War. Of course, the Portuguese, this doesn't do justice to the Portuguese because they had trading villages all the way back to the late 1400s, early 1500s. But by the time the Dutch, French, and British and the United States arrive in Southeast Asia, all the Portuguese had left was Timor, was East Timor. And this area is of extreme importance. Why is this particular area so important to these colonial powers? Now, this map doesn't do justice. There's just not a lot of maps that really explain this very well, but the Suez Canal would eventually be built, but before the Suez Canal and before the Panama Canal was built, European powers, in order to trade with Asia, had to go around the southern tip of Africa. And so it would be the Portuguese that would first establish these trading villages. They had dockings in Cape Town, Goa, Sri Lanka, Madagascar, parts of modern-day Bangladesh, and then eventually they would settle at the Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca is just conveniently located right next to one of the wealthiest city-states in Southeast Asia, known as Singapore. Singapore is a banking capital and trading capital of this particular area. Now, Kuala Lumpur is also in a very important location as well, hence why it is such a large city and why it was chosen as Malaysia's capital city. This area is of the utmost importance because of shipping routes. Once the Suez Canal was built and the Panama Canal was built, this area did not become less important, it actually became more important. Trade with China, India, and the spice trade with the rest of Southeast Asia was really important to European wealth and control, and so that's why this particular region goes under the control of European powers. But it's not the only reason. It's not just spice trade that's being traded in Southeast Asia. And this will be the last thing that we really cover for this particular section. It's titled The Vietnam War and Heroin Smuggling. Now, this is just in reference to the Vietnam War, but people often ask, why was Vietnam so important? After Vietnam declared its independence from France in 1945, a series of battles ensued when France was already stretched thin from World War II. Ho Chi Minh would eventually become the premier of Vietnam, declared Vietnam a communist state. Now, I put this with an asterisk. It wasn't really communist in the way, but it was reported by the United States that it was communist. In fact, Ho Chi Minh actually designed his constitution after the U.S. Constitution and declared himself free and actually requested help from the United States. However, at this particular time, U.S. corporations and intelligence bureaus such as the OSS, which would later become the CIA, were running heroin from the Golden Triangle, which was through Burma, Thailand, and Laos, and then eventually to Vietnam. That heroin then would be shipped to the United States and distributed on the streets of the U.S. Now, the United States was afraid of losing its main source of income in Southeast Asia, and I'm not putting the entire United States at cause of this. It's really largely up to it was largely responsible. It was really the CIA and the OSS that was largely responsible for this. I've got a link here that really kind of goes into a little bit more detail. It's titled Covert Action Information Bulletin, the CIA and Drugs. It says here, it is clearly appropriate once again to underscore the enormity of the CIA's sordid role in the world of drug trafficking. As we show in this issue, the CIA has been, from its inception, a major source of opium, heroin, and now crack. Revelations that planes which fly weapons to anti-Sandinista Contras in Honduras and Costa Rica return filled with drugs may, if they are allowed to be fully explored, yet shock the conscience of the American people, numbed by the decade of equally incredible revelations. So this talks a lot about this, but you can go in here. There's also some great information. Southeast Asia, Opium Trail. Why was this area fraught with opium transportation? Well, as we've kind of discussed before, before, during, and shortly after World War II, China was going through a civil war, and Mao Zedong's forces in the north were taking control of most of the territory, and they were pushing out the U.S.-backed nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek into the jungles of Burma. Some of those Chinese nationalists would eventually make their way to Taiwan and form the Taiwanese government there. But forces still remained in Myanmar. Well, the United States government could no longer pay for nationalist forces through congressional funding. So they had to pay for it some other way. And the way that they chose to pay for it was by smuggling heroin out of Burma through Laos, Cambodia, and then shipping it out of Vietnam into the United States. And then that black budget money would be used to fund the nationalist forces. Well, once Ho Chi Minh steps in, the United States needed to protect its assets in Vietnam. And so they reported what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And if you look up information on the Gulf of Tonkin incident, it would be, by most people's definition, considered a false flag. It was something that was created in order to force us into a war that we had no reason to go into. In fact, the Gulf of Tonkin incident never really happened, and the United States government would cover that up, and it was only rediscovered recently that it was fake, a completely made up story. Other people argued since in what's become known as the domino theory. I haven't really discussed this, but according to the domino theory, you can go to the historychannel.com, not a great website, but it gives us at least a general idea. Domino theory was a Cold War policy that suggested a communist government in one nation would quickly lead to communist takeovers in neighboring states, each falling like a perfectly aligned row of dominoes. Using this as the excuse to invade Vietnam. However, if anybody knows anything about Vietnamese history, the Vietnamese were in no trouble of falling under the sphere of influence of China. They did not trust China, and they had a historical, somewhat ill-natured relationship with China. And in fact, there's not really a lot of evidence that Ho Chi Minh originally wanted to institute full-blown communism. Although there was, there is some evidence that he did want to institute some redistributive policies. It wasn't. It was being made into something that it really wasn't. Anyways, I hope that you learned some things, and I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you.